So Angry Joe just released his rapid fire review of Armored Core 6. I myself recently just got done platinuming the game just a couple of days ago. I've been a fan of Angry Joe for the better part of over a decade, but I normally don't tune into his rapid fire reviews for a multitude of reasons. Most of those being that the rapid fire reviews, to me, he just clearly does not put as much effort into analyzing the game and breaking it down, and they clearly don't have his full attention. I believe Other Joe is doing the rapid fire reviews nowadays. But regardless, on social media, I saw some of the comments that were being made in the review, and people were getting very, very upset, understandably to an extent. But I haven't watched the review yet, so that's what we're going to do today, and I'm going to interrupt where I feel is necessary and break down some of the points that I feel would be pretty interesting to talk about. So before we jump in, if you guys like content like this, feel free to subscribe. I'm going to be making more Armored Core 6 content in the future, and let's get into it.
Though I won't pretend that there aren't just some truly bullshit attacks, because this is a FromSoft game. But as the internet told me, I just needed to get good to avoid them.
Shit! They're good.
They're good.
They're good.
They're good.
Now, Alex here criticizes Armored Core 6 for having bullshit attacks. He doesn't really go into detail or show any examples of what he means by this, so I'm going to just interpret he means attacks that he feels are unfair. Now, by what metric they're unfair, he doesn't really elaborate. But he then goes on to say that From Software is known for these types of attacks, which I very much disagree with. I think the Souls games and From Software are very much known for how fair their games are. Now, of course, in every single game, no matter how tight your game design is, you're going to have some wonky hitboxes, you're going to have some elements that are just not 100% perfect, and it is completely fair to criticize those things, but without an example being given or Alex really going into detail to tell me, what he means by this, I do feel like it's an unfair criticism, especially since, in my opinion, I can't think of any boss or enemy that has real bullshit attacks off the top of my head, and I've platinumed the game, and I've put like 60 hours into it, so I think this criticism is a bit unfair.
The one gripe I had about customization, though, is a lack of overall balance. All builds are not created equal here. Some of them, at least when I finished the game, were very much overtuned and almost trivialized some of the encounters.
So this is a common criticism brought up against Armored Core 6 about the weapon balance and the build balance, and to some degree I can see why people would think this. You can definitely create builds that trivialize most of the enemies in the game, including the bosses, and some builds are certainly stronger than others for sure, but I very much think this is intentional. This is not like Dark Souls in the sense that if you're a dex build, if you're a strength build, a faith build, intelligence build, whatever, that you can beat every single boss. Now, of course, if you are a magic build in Elden Ring, you're likely going to have less trouble with most of the bosses in the game than if you're a strength build. But if you have high enough strength, you're going to be doing massive amounts of damage. I don't think the difference between how difficult the game is going to be that great. Whereas in Armored Core 6, there's a much bigger focus on builds. Some builds are going to absolutely dominate certain bosses, and other builds are going to struggle immensely. But this encourages changing your build and experimenting. If you're struggling with a boss and your build is just not working out, that's the incentive to go to the part shop, go to the assembly, and mess around with things that you might have never bothered to mess around with. I know if the game never forced me to change builds, I probably would have just used a reverse joint lightweight build the entire game. But because there were points where I needed to change my build in order to overcome a challenge, I would try new weapons, new parts. I tried the tetrapod legs, the tank legs, all kinds of stuff, right? So I do think this is very much an intentional design choice, and I think it's for the better. Like I said, this is not Elden Ring. They're not trying to curate an experience where every build has a somewhat similar level of difficulty with every single obstacle. That is why the assembly and the checkpoint system exists. When you die to a boss, they give you the option to change your build right then and there, so it's very much intentional.
The only other aspect of the gameplay that I found that was disappointing was the mission design. Overall, the missions between the big encounters are useless. The enemies in them account for less than speed bumps. You just tear through them as if they weren't even there. And some of these missions finished in a few minutes as well. It felt like I spent more time loading in and out of the missions than I did fighting anything. It would have been very easy to include a mech duel or a mini-boss or something to justify their existence.
When it comes to the level design or mission design of Armored Core 6, I do feel like this criticism is pretty invalid. He complains that a lot of the enemies are basically just speed bumps. Now, granted, in the footage that you're seeing, he's clearly using a tank tread double chain gun build, one of the strongest, most OP builds in the game, and he likely did not find this build out for himself. This is very much an online type of thing where if you go online and you look up the strongest builds in the game, that's one of the top ones. So it's very likely that he did not find this build on his own. He probably saw it, somebody talk about it, or saw it on a list or something like that. So it's like, yeah, if you use a build that's extremely overpowered, I mean, yeah, you're going to run through most of the game. That's kind of the point of like an overpowered build. But even so, the normal MTs and non-AC, LC, and, you know, boss type enemies, mini boss type enemies, yeah, they're going to be speed bumps. That's kind of the point. He mentions that a lot of the missions are useless and they're over in a couple of minutes, and that's because those missions are used for grinding money, so that you don't have to grind hours and hours and hours. If every mission was 35 minutes long and you wanted to grind for parts, or money for parts, you would be spending an insane amount of time, and that just wouldn't be fun. It would completely ruin the pace of the game. And it just definitely would not be optimal for the game, for sure. It would for sure be detrimental. Especially since, if you notice, most of those extremely fast missions are early game missions. And that's very much intentional.
It's not like you're getting story in these missions either, because there really isn't a story here. Now, I understand that almost no one is playing Armored Core 6 for its story or its characters, but that doesn't excuse what we were given. Now, I don't need George R.R. Martin making a new world for robot jocks to blow each other up in, but some effort would have been nice.
Oh, brother!
He goes on to say that there's no story in Armored Core 6 and that nobody plays Armored Core 6 for the characters or the story. And on one hand, he's right. Even me, a Souls veteran, I absolutely adore FromSoft, and I adore the story in this game. When I picked up Armored Core 6, I was expecting to not care about the story or characters because of what I have heard about past Armored Core games. But I was completely blown away by the story. I think the story is fantastic. And I think the reason they're getting so much outrage over this specific part of the review is because this is a very tired, old criticism of Souls games. We have been hearing this since Dark Souls 1 or Demon Souls. People will play these games, and because they're not spoon-fed to you like God of War Ragnarok or Spider-Man PS4, which there's nothing wrong with that form of storytelling, but FromSoft does not tell their stories in this cinematic storybook movie type of way. A lot of their story is background lore. You have to read logs, you have to read item descriptions, look at the environmental storytelling. And even with AC6, a lot of the story is mostly upfront, but even so, a lot of the dialogue is vague and cryptic, and there's a lot of stuff left out, and there's just a ton of things that you're not going to understand unless, you do a deep dive into the lore or you look up, VaatiVidya or somebody. But nevertheless, these are how these games have always been, and they have fantastic stories. And I think this is kind of a problem with these rapid fire reviews. Joe, Other Joe, and Alex, they have so many games to review, and this is their job, and this is a problem for not just them, but a lot of reviewers who their job is reviewing video games. If they get stuck on a boss, or if the game's taking too long, they feel the need to rush through it and not really pay attention or analyze the game the best they could, because they have to hurry up and get on to the next, mainstream game so that they can get that review out. And that just leads to extremely poor analysis, unfortunately. It's kind of a paradox because on one hand, these guys are paid to review and analyze video games, yet if you look at the footage, they're normally not very good, and they rush out these reviews because they're trying to keep up with every single release. And I'm not trying to say that Angry Joe, Other Joe, or Alex, that they're bad at video games because I'm trying to dunk on them. That's not what I mean. What I mean is because these guys have so little time to invest in any one particular game, they just end up not being able to learn the ins and outs and the fundamentals and what makes these games so great, because it takes time. FromSoft games aren't Call of Duty. You can't just sit down, pick them up, play them, understand everything about them, and then that's just it within, one play session. I think every From Software fan can tell you that their first FromSoft game, they probably picked it up, absolutely despised it because they were getting their ass beat, put it down, came back, and then it eventually clicked. And then even after all that, you gotta look up lore. There's still a bunch of new things to get used to and to learn. It's not just this thing you can sit down and you get all of it and that's it. So I definitely think this is a pretty bad criticism. I don't think it's a product of Alex being unfair to the game. He's been positive about the game so far. I do think he genuinely likes the game. He's made some good points throughout the video about the customization, that the controls are, pretty good, and this and that or whatever, his more positive points. And I'm not trying to say that Armored Core doesn't have any valid criticisms, because you can definitely make valid criticisms against Armored Core 6. It's just these in particular are not very good. This review is clearly half-baked, and I just think they didn't put as much time or focus into this as, they would the angry reviews. I think that's pretty clear, and that leads to takes like this.
The campaign itself may only be about 15 hours long, but adding in the arena and just tinkering in the mech bay, and I certainly feel you'll get your money's worth.
Now, Alex does go in to say that the game is only about 15 hours long, which I would certainly disagree with, especially if you do all 3 playthroughs. And I think 3 playthroughs is really mandatory to be able to say that you beat the game, because there is a lot of original new content in New Game Plus and New Game Plus 2, and 3 separate endings and just completely new missions and parts and stuff like that. So I think to be able to say you even beat Armored Core 6, you'd have to beat it 3 times. And at that point, especially if you're doing the arena and the time it takes to customize your AC and tinker with it and then testing it out and testing weapons, I'm well over 50 hours and I've barely played any PvP. Now, I did platinum the game, but those first 3 playthroughs definitely took me over 15 hours, 100%, that's for sure. I do think it's at least more like in the 20 to 25 hour range, maybe even higher, if you factor in things like PvP and how much you change up your mech and, all that type of stuff. So that was Angry Joe's rapid fire review of Armored Core 6. I do think most of the negative criticisms that Alex had were just a cause of the review being half-baked. They clearly did not put as much time and effort into this review as something like an angry review, of course, and that definitely shows, unfortunately. They did not give it the time of day to really delve into the story or pay attention to anything that was happening in that regard, and that's kind of what's leading to the negative response they're getting on this video. And I do have some sympathy for them, because from a certain standpoint, I can understand that this is their job. They have to hurry up and rush out these reviews so that they can get on to the next game. But on the other hand, it's also their job, and they should make sure that these reviews are thorough and that they're paying attention to everything in the game. At the end of the day, Alex gave it an 8, which I think is a pretty fair score, even with the criticisms that he had of the game. Personally, I have it at a 9 or a 9.5. But I think the end score is fine, and it's just those criticisms that kind of come out of not paying full attention that really angered people, which is pretty understandable. But yeah, guys, that'll be it for this video. If you guys enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subbing to the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.